Hallo Leute, ich bin Katja und ihr seht Deutsch für euch. Oh my god, what happened? New camera, still the same room but just another side of it. So this is gonna be the view that you're gonna have of me for now, so deal with some more pores and all that stuff. And less mess in the background, which is very relieving for me, I have to say. So today we're going to take on another group of verbs, and that is a group that I left out when I originally got started on the topic. They are another pretty important bunch of little fellas that are known in most languages as that other kind of verb. What am I talking about? Reflexive verbs, of course. These are verbs that relate back to the subject of a sentence using reflexive pronouns. In English, these reflexive pronouns are words like myself, yourself, herself, themselves, you know, that kind of stuff. The German words for these, Reflexive Pronomen, as we say, will look pretty familiar to you because for once we do not have to learn new words for these. Instead, we get to use the respective case of the appropriate personal pronoun. That is because the reflexive pronomen are basically just the accusative and the dative of personal pronouns, at least for most grammatical persons. That would be the first and second person, both singular and plural. So the reflexive pronomen can be mich, mir, dich, dir, uns, uns, euch, euch, and then nothing new, the third person is once again the thing causing all the problems here. The third person, both singular and plural, that is, use the only unique reflexive pronoun there is, and that is sich. New to you as it might be, the nice thing about this little fella is that it is the same in both accusative and dative, and also for all three genders and singular and plural. So no matter if we have er, sie, es, or the plural sie, the reflexive pronomen is always sich. Always. Sich is also used for the infinitive form of reflexive verbs, by the way. So let's go through an example. Sich konzentrieren. Literally, to concentrate oneself. Now, obviously, this doesn't mean that somebody is cooking up a concentrate of themselves, but rather that the person is concentrating in the sense of focusing on something. This is one of the reflexive verbs that only exists as reflexive verbs, also called true reflexive verbs. So, forms. Ich konzentriere mich, du konzentrierst dich, er, sie, es konzentriert sich, wir konzentrieren uns, ihr konzentriert euch, and sie konzentrieren sich. So from this we can draw a few conclusions. Firstly, you can see that the verb itself, so konzentrieren, is still conjugated the same way that all other verbs are conjugated. Same endings, everything. This is also true for irregular reflexive verbs, by the way. So that means that the pronouns and the endings stay the same, so the things that change for irregular reflexive verbs are the same things that change within irregular normal verbs. If you don't know what changes those are, check out this video in which I talked about the changes that can happen in irregular verbs. Secondly, as I hinted at before conjugating sich konzentrieren, there are two kinds of reflexive verbs, that being true and false reflexive verbs. This means that there is one group that just has to be used reflexively because that is their base form, like sich konzentrieren. There is no non-reflexive version of them, so none without the reflexive pronoun, at least not with the same meaning. So in this case, sich konzentrieren, the verb konzentrieren exists, but it actually means to concentrate something in the sense of cooking something down. So to focus on something, to concentrate on something, only exists as sich konzentrieren. The other group, the false reflexive verbs, are verbs that have a normal, if you can say that, base usage, but can also be used reflexively if the subject is doing the action to themselves. So one example for that would be waschen, to wash. Normally this verb is used with an accusative object, but since it's very possible and also very common to wash yourself, it can also be used reflexively. Its infinitive then becomes sich waschen. To make these verbs even clearer, we can also add a selbst, which means self. So I could also say ich wasche mich selbst instead of just saying ich wasche mich, to make clear that I'm washing myself as in contrast to somebody or something else. Hast du etwas gewaschen? Ja, mich selbst. And thirdly, we can see that when these verbs are conjugated, the reflexive pronoun stands after the verb and not before it, like in the infinitive. On second thought, if you consider that thing like a replacement for an object, that should make sense. And like with normal objects, it is theoretically possible to exchange the positions of subject and object. So instead of saying ich wasche mich, I could also say mich wasche ich, if I wanted to emphasize that it is me who I am washing in contrast to something else. But just like with normal objects, this order is very context-based and therefore relatively rare. I'm just saying it's grammatically possible. So, in simple sentences that contain a reflexive verb, the reflexive pronoun works exactly like an accusative object. The only difference is that now the accusative object happens to be the subject itself. So not that hard to understand, right? Now, the same problem as always is, not all sentences consist of 3 words. Wouldn't that be awesome though? I mean, picture it, we'd all be speaking hundreds of languages. We'd never get our point across, but we'd speak them, because after all, that's what being a polyglot is really about, right? Right? Anyway, since this is not the case, we have to go back to something that I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, and that is that reflexive pronoun exists in both the dative and the accusative. As you know, there are verbs in German that trigger an accusative, there are verbs that trigger a dative, and there are verbs that trigger both. Now for the case where we have both, we need a way for that to work with a reflexive pronoun. So remember waschen? Waschen is normally just accompanied by an accusative, but it can also be accompanied by an additional dative, and that is when the subject is not only washing something, but basically washing something for somebody, or the something of somebody or something. Because now I know how to say that I wash myself, but what if I want to say that I just want to wash my hands? Sure, if I'm clever, I could just go with making the hands my accusative object and say ich wasche meine Hände. But that is not the most common way how we say this in German, unfortunately. What we do instead is turn our reflexive pronoun into a dative, which then becomes ich wasche mir die Hände. So literally, I am washing the hands for myself. Die Hände is our accusative object, so the direct object, the thing that is undergoing the actual washing. Mir, so the dative of ich, is our dative object because it is affected by the process of washing, but it's only indirectly affected, so it's the indirect object. Let's look at another example. Ich nehme den Apfel. I'm taking the apple. Now alternatively, I could say that I'm not just taking the apple, I am taking it for myself, so I'm making it my possession. For that, in German, I would say ich nehme mir den Apfel. I am taking the apple for myself. So again, ich is both the subject and the dative object because I am not the one that is being taken, but I'm indirectly affected by the taking of the apple insofar that my state has changed. I now own an apple. Yay me. I know that the concept of accusative and dative object or direct and indirect objects is kind of hard to grasp for somebody that comes from a language that mostly conveys this through prepositions, so feel free to ask if anything stayed unclear. Now the last thing I want to bring up today is 2 special groups of reflexive verbs, and that is one group that is always combined with a certain preposition, and the other group in which the reflexive pronoun is always the dative object. One example for each: sich an etwas gewöhnen, to get used to something. This verb is always combined with a preposition an, and therefore always goes with an additional accusative object. So I could have a sentence like ich habe mich an die Arbeit gewöhnt. I have gotten used to the work. So we have mich in the accusative because that is our reflexive pronoun, and we also have die Arbeit in the accusative because that is an accusative object caused by the preposition an. And for the other group, the one with mandatory dative reflexive pronoun, sich etwas kaufen, to buy something for yourself. Of course, kaufen isn't always reflexive because we buy other things than ourselves, but when it is, it can only go with a dative object because if we had an accusative object, which would then have to be the reflexive pronoun, we would end up with the sentence ich kaufe mich, which means I am buying myself. And since this is an ancient Rome, I really hope you won't need that sentence ever in your life. Instead, our accusative object here is the thing that we're buying. It's indicated through etwas in the infinitive, sich etwas kaufen. So for example, I could buy myself a shirt. Ich kaufe mir ein Hemd. Again, the shirt is the thing being bought and is therefore the accusative, the direct object. And I am the one indirectly affected by that buying action because I now own a shirt. So I am the indirect object, the dative object. These are two examples, but in the end you will have to learn these things by either learning by doing, or you just take some list and learn them by heart, whichever works better for you. Unfortunately, that list thing is something that I can't provide through a video. However, after this episode airs, my patrons will find an extra document in their Dropbox folder. It will contain a list of the most important reflexive pronoun and also the prepositions that they always need, if they always need a certain preposition, and the most important ones of those that always need an additional accusative object, so like sich etwas kaufen. If you do not have access to this folder yet, but would like to become a part of it, you can do so by becoming a DFE patron on my Patreon account, which is linked in the description. And then I will add you to the folder once your first pledge goes through. Thanks in advance! Anyway, that's it for today. Your random word of the week is das Rotkehlchen. Literally, this is a belittled version of what would mean red throat. Rote Kehle. Rotkehlchen. And that's why it's neutral, because we have the chen ending on it again. Bis nächste Woche. Tschüss!